Jennifer Gerber. I didn't see her on the screen. Is she actually on the screen?
I'm here.
Ah, lovely. Brilliant.
I can see
Okay.
you, David.
Well
Hi.
done. Jennifer has worked in the very heart of government. She was a special advisor in Her Majesty's Treasury, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, the Department of Health under Andy Burnham. She was a director of one of the most useful think tanks the Labour Party had, which is Progress. And she worked for Prime Minister Tony Blair in 2001 and 2005. For the last 10 years, until her retirement, she was the director of Labour Friends of Israel. And needless to say, she didn't have an easy ride. And Jennifer, I've discussed with people the sort of issues we'd like to discuss with you this evening. And there's one subject which pretty much everybody wants to talk about. And I think you can guess what that is, who it is. It's Jeremy Corbyn. Now, one of your distinguished predecessors, David Menzer, mentioned to me when he was director of LFI, that the door to number 10 was always open when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were prime ministers. Can you help us with this? Was the door ever open when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the opposition?
Okay, firstly, I'd just like to say thank you very much for inviting me this evening. It's really nice to speak to you all, and especially at a shul where my husband was bar mitzvahed, which is rather special. So what was the door to Jeremy Corbyn open? First of all, I should probably say I'm rather glad he didn't end up at number 10. So there was no question of that door ever needing to be open to anyone. But the reality is no, not really. I mean, I think when he became leader, most people who knew anything about politics knew that he was not a friend of Israel and probably not a friend to the Jewish community. But there was also the sense of, why don't we give this person a chance and see? And, you know, partly so we can always say we tried to open a dialogue, but also I think because people are ultimately optimists and they wanted to believe he could change. So initially, for example, my organisation, Labour Friends of Israel, we invited him to attend one of our events, and it didn't go well. He came to a Labour Friends of Israel reception at Labour Party conference and wasn't able to utter the word Israel. Yeah. Now, I think there's a point at which you can either accept that, you know, there's an issue and kind of this is going to be a problem, and what do you do? And we at Labour Friends of Israel, unlike some other groups, thought, you know what, this person isn't willing to have an open dialogue with us. His mind is closed. And I think that was part of the problem. His mind from the start was closed. So what we did try and do is speak to maybe some people around him, but no, his door certainly wasn't open. I think Jeremy Corbyn had spent 30, 40 years on platforms saying the same thing about Israel, Palestine, world affairs. He wasn't about to start changing his, you know, worldview, age nearly 70 in 2015. And that was ultimately very depressing, regrettable, but that was before we kind of realized quite how bad it would get.
Well, I think the majority of the audience this evening will have no doubts at all that Jeremy Corbyn was anti-Semitic. But can we just step back a bit and let me ask you this. We think he's anti-Semitic, but do you countenance the possibility that he genuinely thinks he isn't? I mean, we remember the incident with the mural, the wreath laying for the terrorists who tortured and killed the Israeli athletes, his association with Holocaust deniers, his getting money from Iran to conduct one of their programs. But do you think there's any possibility that he genuinely doesn't think he's anti-Semitic?
Yes, I think I think Jeremy Corbyn to this day absolutely refuses to accept, acknowledge that he's anti-Semitic, that he's a racist. I think that was part of the problem. I think if you were to ask Jeremy, you know, I think he would say himself a lifelong anti-racist. And I think it's very difficult when Jewish community groups were coming in and explaining to him why what he was doing was problematic, why they felt the party had become an anti, you know, Jewish, a racist institution. He wouldn't accept it because he was never willing to accept his own responsibility and role in what happened to the Labour Party. And I think that's a very difficult thing, because actually, whether you think you're not, or is, you know, if you have a whole group of people saying, actually, we think you are, you know, being anti-Semitic, and actually, you know, there was a lot of tiptoeing around that. Even a lot of my colleagues, even now, would probably say they're not sure whether he was anti-Semitic or not. So it wasn't necessarily straightforward, but I think Jeremy Corbyn absolutely to this day does not believe he is anti-Semitic, and which is strange, isn't it, really? Because
he doesn't view anything he's said or done as being anti-Semitic. It's all against imperialism and Zionism and colonialism and occupation and things like that. He just can't see it.
No, and I think you're right. He'd say he's not anti-Semitic. He's anti the government of Israel. He wouldn't even necessarily say he's anti-Israel, even though everything he's done and said, you know, absolutely points to that. But I know, you know, people are in meetings with him and trying to explain the concept of, you know, the fact that your views on Israel, the only Jewish country, are problematic. I think he was unable to see that, and he would absolutely see it as anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist, left-wing. And that's why, you know, we had the anti-Semitic mural. To anyone else, you look at that mural and what do you think? It was so obvious, the caricatures of Jews, and the, you know, in our head we're thinking about all of these kind of hundreds of years of anti-Semitic tropes. And what did Jeremy Corbyn see? Well, apparently not that. He just saw rich people, you know, persecuting poor people. And I think that was part of the problem. Even those, it's, you know, subsequently people who've worked with him, and, you know, now they no longer work with him and he's no longer leader, feel a little bit able to speak more honestly, will say that he absolutely would not countenance the idea that, you know, in any way was he kind of anti-Semitic. And I think that's why it became so impossible for anything to be done in the Labour Party to change the terrible situation it had gotten itself into.
Well, I think the consensus of opinion outside his own hardline supporters is that he was a complete disaster. But there's one aspect of his agenda that he succeeded on, and that's this. Under his leadership, his supporters managed to wipe out every prominent pro-Israeli voice in the Parliamentary Labour Party. Dame Louise Ellman, 50 years in the Labour Party, Luciana Berger, Joan Ryan, John Woodcock, Ian Austin, Mike Gapes, Lord Treesman, Frank Field, all gone. In that respect, do you think he succeeded in promoting the agenda?
I mean, it's sad, isn't it, when you say that and you realise that these people faced such a difficult decision. And there was always this debate in the Labour Party, which is, do you stay and fight, in which case you remain in the party? And some people did. There were other MPs like Ruth Smeeth, for example, a Jewish MP. She lost her seat, but she fought for it as a Labour MP. Or do you leave the party? So my organisation, Labour Friends of Israel, had Louise Ellman as our chair. Yeah. And Joan Ryan as our chair, both left the Labour Party, as you say, because of anti-Semitism. Joan, by the way, who isn't Jewish and very much not Jewish, of Catholic ancestry, but was labelled a Jew and sadly received a huge amount of anti-Semitic hate. So they did leave. And yes, you're right, the Parliamentary Labour Party has far fewer Jews in it and far fewer Friends of Israel. But I think for those who left, they partly had to leave because they could not, hand on heart, knock on people's doors asking them to vote Labour and to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. And I also think you had to have, in a way, the small number who did leave, I think made, a disproportionate impact on perhaps the public's perception of Jeremy Corbyn, which isn't to say anti-Semitism was necessarily the only reason, or a big reason, but I think it certainly chimed with the public's concerns about this man. Is he a fit and proper person? Do we want him entering number 10? And so it is a real shame. I mean, this is the Labour Party who, once had a huge number of Jewish MPs, and also was absolutely more than a safe space for Jews, and, a place where actually prime ministers and leaders and ministers and councillors and all the way through were, incredibly supportive and welcoming, and visited Israel and loved Israel. And, it is a terrible place to be, that you had so many people leaving. Now, I think that, the challenge is, I guess, where do we go from here? And obviously I'm not, I'm no longer working at LFI, but I do think what is left is something that is a tricky, how do you rebuild from that point?
Well, let's step back a bit and let's try and see how we got here. Because I think you and I remember people like Peter Shaw, Barbara Castle. I mean, I remember 20 years ago, she was in a wheelchair. I wheeled her into the Brighton Convention Centre, and one of the things she said to me was, how's LFI going? Ian Mercado, remember Ian Mercado? I mean, good grief, if Mercado was still alive, he'd have thrown Corbyn out the window. I mean, so you had this solid support, especially on the Tribune left of the Party for Israel. What happened? I mean, let me just give you two examples of things that absolutely gobsmacked me. One was a Labour mayor of Bradford, a man called Kadim Hussein, who said that Hitler killed 6 million Zionists, including Anne Frank. Israel created ISIS. And another individual who you highlighted when you were director of LFI, a man called Robin Turner, a Labour mayor for Derby, who said that Holocaust, study of the Holocaust achieved a disproportionate prominence in schools. Now, I mean, it's bad enough if people harbour these views silently, but they plastered these views on Facebook and Twitter. How did these people get into the Labour Party, and how did it change so dramatically from the solid pro-Israel stand of people like Peter Shaw, Barbara Castle and Ian Mercado, and of course Harold Wilson?
And I mean, bring it kind of right up to date, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's a really hard question to answer. And I think what is very tricky was the speed at which things changed. Now, different people, I can only talk from my own personal perspective about what happened to the Labour Party. And I think different people will start, their analysis earlier or later, or with this person or that person. But I think there's always been, I mean, I'm not, there are people like Dave Rich and David Hirsch who talk and write far better than I do about the kind of history of anti-Semitism on the left. But I think there has always been a history of anti-Semitism on the left, and certainly more recently with anti-Zionism on the left, and a very tricky relationship that the left has with Israel. And I saw that a little bit in the Labour Party, probably starting from the Second Intifada, going on, and various wars that, the various Gazan wars, obviously the Lebanese wars, the Second Lebanese War earlier, and people, there would be a disproportionate focus on Israel, let's say, which I think as a Jewish member of the Labour Party then did make me feel a bit uncomfortable, especially because I'd look around the world and I'd see a lot of things happening elsewhere, and I'd kind of wonder why it was Israel they were talking about. So there's always been that little bit of tension. But you've had Gordon Brown and Tony Blair and Harold Wilson. The party, even though there could be elements in the grassroots that were problematic, it was led by broadly sensible people who wouldn't countenance the idea that a minority view of Israel or an obsession would be something that could take the leadership. It was something that mad members in a branch, it's somewhere in deep dark North London, perhaps, debated. Now, I think what happened with Jeremy Corbyn, it was happening a bit before him, a little bit, and I think there were certain things, red lines that were perhaps blurring in people's language about Israel. But I think what shocked so many people was when Jeremy Corbyn became leader. First of all, the Labour Party was opened up to lots of members, so you could, I don't know if anyone remembers, it was kind of £1 to join the Labour Party. So I think essentially a lot of people who weren't Labour Party members, they were the fringes of the ultra left, joined. And they joined to vote for Jeremy. And why did they join to vote for Jeremy? Because they shared his worldview. So I think there was a kind of infiltration of hard left members. And I think, unfortunately, an assumption, and I include myself, in kind of the moderates of the party, that progress goes in one direction. And of course, this person's not going to win. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was a joke. I knew it, when I was a kind of researcher in 2001 in Parliament, Jeremy Corbyn, he was not a serious person. So there was a kind of, you take your eye off the ball a little bit. You assume things will always be okay and sensible people get elected. And so I think it was a shock. It was a combination of two things. And then with the anti-Semitism, I think, unfortunately, you had a combination of all these new members with their old obsessions with Israel and with Jews, because I think sometimes the two are indistinguishable in terms of how they perceive things, or certainly the tropes they would use against Jews became tropes they used against Israel, and justifying it because it's talking about Israel, not Jews, even though they were exactly the same language that was used previously. And I think that, it's kind of a study, isn't it, into any kind of infiltration and a dominant force and the psychology of a kind of, group of people who suddenly found themselves weirdly in a minority, and those were the moderates. And perhaps, and I think, not brave. And I think there was a lack of bravery at the beginning. There was a sense of, well, he's leader, we've got to go along with this. And then I think more and more, the party suddenly realised these people were, they were dominant in local parties. They could put pressure on their MPs, and the worldview that Jeremy had, he reflected that in his cabinet. He reflected that in the leadership of the Labour Party, in his general secretary. So it became harder and harder for the moderates, they would say, to gain any traction. But, I think that there's a deeper issue, which is why is the left obsessed with Jews, and I guess more recently Israel. And that's, lots of, various reasons. But I was on the kind of Israel end of it. And all I know is that I saw people who didn't utter a word about any, Assad could gas however many children and women he wanted.
I'd like to ask you about that. I'd like to ask you about that. This blind spot. This blind spot I simply don't understand. I mean, it's very difficult to know exactly what the figure is, but most people think that about 40,000 Kurdish men, women, and children have been killed by Erdogan's Turkish armed forces. Apart from Gary Kent, who I think is a friend of yours, as he is of mine, do we see Kurdish flags being waved at the end of a Labour Party conference? Baluchistan, there is a terrible occupation by Pakistani forces on the people of Baluchistan. You see videos on Twitter which are just heartbreaking. Nothing. Total silence, both in the Labour Party manifesto and in fringe groups. No interest at all about the Kurds or the Baluchis. I mean, why is that?
I mean, there's a slightly flippant term, isn't there, which is no Jews, no news. And I think partly that came about because of people's frustrations on that. And I was always careful about how to use that, because actually I don't, people can pick and choose what they're interested in. And just because you're interested in one element of foreign affairs, you don't have to be interested in all of them. But you're right. If you proclaim your interest in Israel as about human rights, well, as you say, look what's happening elsewhere in the world. And if you say it's about imperialism or it's about a country and dividing lines, well, look at, India and Pakistan and Kashmir. There's plenty of things you could kind of pick on. And you're right. I mean, actually, the Gary Kent and the Kurdish groups, no, there were no Kurdish flags waved at conference, though I should say the Kurdish groups always showed a huge amount of solidarity with us at Labour Friends of Israel. And when they, as a delegation, attended Labour conference, they were amongst the friendliest delegates to come up to our stand, and rather than abuse us, which was often the case in the last few years, incredibly nasty abuse myself and my staff would have to experience, they would always come up and show solidarity. And I think the obsession with Israel, I mean, some people, it does make you question kind of what is this about this tiny little Jewish state that, yes, if you're on the left, I understand Bibi isn't your, friend and you wouldn't vote that way, but it is a democracy. And yes, there are tricky issues that they're grappling with. And there are lots of progressives in Israel, like there are in this country, who have issues with the government of the day. But in prioritizing Israel above all else, I think it does show deep down this uncomfortable obsession with, I think ultimately with kind of Jews and a sense that when we were victims, there was a lot of solidarity, I think. And they always say this, like when Jeremy talks about Cable Street or the Holocaust, and it's like, when Jews were victims or couldn't protect themselves, or it's to do with the Holocaust, and it sounds crude, but Jews sadly who are no longer with us, there's an empathy. And when it comes to real living Jews who at times have had to fight for their survival, there's a lot less support.
You say that, but he was a friend of a man called Paul Eisen, who's one of the leading Holocaust deniers in the UK.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I heard what he said when he came back from a concentration camp. But then on the other hand, what's he doing associating with Paul Eisen, giving money to his organization?
And he also refused to ever attend. I mean, Isaac Herzog, the then leader of the Israeli Labour Party, and ourselves we sent an invite to Jeremy Corbyn to attend, to visit Israel, to go to Yad Vashem, to lay a wreath in, memory of the victims of the Holocaust. He refused to do that.
Yeah, sorry, you sent him an invitation and he actually refused to go.
And the invitation came from Isaac Herzog, who was the Israeli Labour leader, and he refused.
I remember this.
We ended up taking Tom Watson, who was then the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Yeah. And I think at that point, we weren't taking him to Sderot. We were, it wasn't it's not political, is it? You're going to the World Holocaust, Memorial Centre to lay a wreath. But we know where he lays wreaths, to be quite frank, and to be slightly crude, and it's not at Yad Vashem.
Let's move on to Sir Keir Starmer. How do you think he's faring, both in terms of stabilising the Labour Party as a proper, legitimate, responsible opposition party, and how do you think he's faring in attracting back Jewish support for the Labour Party?
Yeah, so look, I mean, the bar, in some ways, Keir has it very easy. In some ways, he has it unbelievably hard. So I think there's progress being made. And look, he is the soft left, not the hard left. He's a mainstream, sensible politician. And I think he is, it's back to basics again. He understands how politics works. He hasn't got an extreme agenda. I think he's marginally interested in foreign affairs, but it's certainly not the driver in his political career like it was for Jeremy Corbyn. So, undeniably, the Labour Party is in a far better place with Keir Starmer, both in terms of its morals and its values, but also its electability than it ever was under Jeremy Corbyn. However, what Keir has inherited is an anti-Semitic party, is a party investigated by, the Equality and Human Rights Commission and found to be anti-Semitic. I mean, that is no small deal. I mean, and he's also inherited, it's not just one of policy, because actually in some ways the policy never really changed. In terms of the manifesto, something, wording was a kind of change here and there, but actually, probably for a lot of people, that was fine. It's the culture of the party. And he has inherited a culture of bullying and anti-Semitic and misogynist and aggressive, Labour Party, which has gone through these 5 years with Jeremy Corbyn as the leader. And now you're going through a period of detoxification. And I think he has shown, thus far, a commitment, an absolute commitment, which I think is heartfelt and genuine, to rooting it out. I think on certain decisions he's been brave, and I think he is absolutely, you know, I know Keir, and I absolutely believe him when he says that he is ashamed of the last 5 years, and he absolutely wants to regain the trust of the Jewish community. However, I think it's going to be hard. And I say that as someone, you know, who I worked in and around the Labour Party for 20 years, and I find it hard to forgive. And I know we should, and, you know, it can be very tricky, can't it? And it wasn't all the MPs and it wasn't all the members, and there were very many good people. But I think it's very difficult to also understand how many good people, my friends included, went round telling people to make Jeremy Corbyn, a man I quite frankly feared, becoming Prime Minister. And so I think for Keir, it's going to be, I think he probably will get there, because a lot of Jewish Labour Party members, they want to return. They're not Tories, they're not Lib Dems. They want the party to return to where it should be. So he's kind of pushing on an open door. But equally, you've got Louise Elman, for example. She left because she faced the most despicable and abhorrent anti-Semitism that anyone, when, you know, I think maybe symbolically, when people like her feel able to rejoin, when they see the actions as well as the words. So let's see, throw these people out. I do, you know, I don't want to kind of be a, you know, join them in their Stalinist show trial kind of politics, but I think we do have to visibly see individuals held to account for what happened in the Labour Party, leaving the Labour Party if they haven't already. I think there is going to have to be a huge amount of work put into making the Jewish community feel safe. And that's not just Jewish Labour, you know, it's not just about the members who are Jewish who left, it's about the whole Jewish community in our country, quite frankly. It's those who, even if you don't necessarily want to vote Labour, you deserve an opposition who you could vote for and who isn't racist. And actually it's a disservice to our democracy to have a party like the Labour Party was in such a terrible state.
Can I put to you a fear which I certainly have, and which I think many other people, I mean, even outside the Jewish community have, and it goes back to 1981. There was a man called Andrew McIntosh, very popular moderate Labour leader, who won the elections for the GLC, the Greater London Council. Far left could never win such an election. Okay, he won the election. Within days, he was toppled in a coup by the far left, by Livingstone, who then became a prominent figure. Am I being unduly sensitive in thinking that the same thing could occur to Keir Starmer? He's got this body of momentum beneath him. They know that nobody's ever going to elect them to government. But if Keir Starmer wins the next election, we could see a coup. Is this a genuine fear, or am I being overly sensitive about this?
Do you know what? Before Jeremy Corbyn, I think I always thought I'm an optimist. I'm going to err on the side of, you know, of course not, and these things don't happen. I certainly wouldn't slam you for being either paranoid or pessimistic or having any fears. I think it would be, I think what's interesting is the power structure of the Labour Party is handed back to the moderates now. However, and so it's unlikely. I think it's really unlikely. It would be very hard for that to happen at the moment. I think the Labour Party is never going to experiment opening itself up to thousands, hundreds of thousands of new members again. So I think there's certain lessons they've learned, but I'm kind of reluctant to say, of course, that won't happen, because barely a year ago, we had Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader fighting a general election. I think, though, there is going to be more of a concerted effort to take back control, the kind of institutions of the Labour Party, and to future-proof them against this happening again. But that isn't to say, I mean, even if you don't have some of the people, I think the problem is, because the party, you know, things become normalized, don't they? And you find yourself accepting a new normal. And the new normal, even without Jeremy and his cranks in the party, is that a level of debate has happened where it does become slightly harder to move back from. So no, I don't think we're going to quite see a Jeremy Corbyn again. But unfortunately, because of what's happened to the Labour Party, I don't think we're going to see a Tony Blair again, for example. And I think the politics has change. And I think for certain people, will they ever feel kind of comfortable? Will they embrace the party? Is there going to be a generation of young Jews who should be joining the Labour Party, becoming MPs, the kind of Louisas, Lucianas, Ruths, etc. of their generation? Well, sadly, I think we've lost a group of people who, you know, should be there, should be within the party, in the same way they should, you know, lots of Jewish members within the Conservative Party. And it's very difficult to kind of come back from that. And I should say, when I was, you know, leading Labour Friends of Israel, the other group who always offered us a lot of solidarity was Conservative Friends of Israel. And they'd always kind of laugh because they'd see what was happening to us, and kind of, I'd compare it to a bit like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and kind of say we're doing everything they are, but backwards and in heels. And I think they recognise that however hard their job is, and it's always hard, you know, being necessarily, you know, making the case for Israel to anyone in certain circumstances, it was extra hard for us. And I think they know now that their please the Labour Party, I would say absolutely their please the Labour Party is where it's, you know, now where it's at. I'm sure, but it's still a very tricky journey.
Let's move on. Let me share with you a little story. In the mid-80s, when I was a baby barrister, I was sent off to defend someone who was being prosecuted by Southwark Council. And I met my opponent, tall, charismatic, dead clever. And I said to him, you look familiar. Who are you? He says, oh, my name's Tony Blair. And I said, well, you know, I've seen you around somewhere. And he says, well, I'm an MP. Which party? He said, Labour. And I said, oh, that's nice. So am I. And I didn't think that within about 12, 13 years, he'd be Prime Minister. And I certainly didn't think that just a few years after that, he'd be one of the leaders of the free world. You had the privilege of working for him, and you got to know him quite well. What legacy do you think he will leave for both the country and the Labour Party?
I mean, I sometimes, when I get a bit kind of despondent about working in politics for 20 years, and sometimes you can, you know, what have I achieved or what have I done? I look back and I think the times, you know, I was able to either spend, you know, with Tony Blair as Prime Minister, see him up close, the people around him, will always be a complete privilege. And I think for so many reasons he left, you know, I think personally left the country in a better place than when he started as, you know, Prime Minister in 1997. And I think the saddest thing for me is that there are some people in the Labour Party who will never ever forgive him for winning 3 elections. Absolutely. And there will always be that kind of preference for ideological purity in their mind, as opposed to what government is, which is day to day making tough decisions that are neither black or white, but are every shade of grey, essentially. And I think, you know, I look back and I think actually the equalities legislation, you know, the stuff we take for granted today, the fact that actually David Cameron, the Conservatives adopted so much, that's due to Tony. Northern Ireland, you think about the Good Friday Agreement, even an interventionist foreign policy, which I know many would argue back at, and obviously with Iraq is incredibly controversial, but I don't think looking outwards at the world and wanting your values and morals to extend beyond your borders is a bad thing. I think that was an incredibly positive thing. And you look at kind of Kosovo and Sierra Leone and elsewhere, and look back at then what happened in '94 in Rwanda, where the world didn't do anything. I can't argue with the fact that, you know, I think he was a force for good. And then there's the kind of domestic policy, actually a politician broadly of the left who was able to convince people that you can invest in our public services and make people's lives better with that investment, but at the same time run, you know, a successful and buoyant economy. I mean, that was a huge battle. If you look, you know, you think back to the 80s and early 90s when Labour was seen as hard left and unelectable and mad. So I think his achievements, you know, are vast, and I think his, you know, the kind of power of his communication, and honestly, you know, I think he's someone who is able to connect and reach beyond your normal kind of electorate. And I think that that's sometimes rare in politics. He did have, you know, there were a few people talk about Clinton and a couple of others who had that ability to connect. And I'm not sure we've had that since.
the man himself, I mean, in 1997, he walks into Downing Street, okay? This is a man who never held ministerial position before. This was his first position in government, prime minister. He wins the election with a 179 seat majority. He's taken out powerful conservative figures like Foreign Minister Malcolm Rifkind, Defence Secretary Michael Portillo, a remarkable electoral victory. Why is he treated with such disdain by so many people within the party? As you say, 3 successive election victories.
Yeah, I mean, it's mad. It's absolutely madness. It's part of the reason why I kind of feel the Labour Party may I think will only truly be 100% sane when it can actually talk about Tony Blair without frothing at the mouth, and actually can not even talk about him without frothing at the mouth, can actually celebrate his achievements. Because you're right, if you're on the left, you look at what he achieved, 3 election victories, and that's, you know, not an end to itself. That's getting into government and changing people's lives. That's building schools, that's, you know, hospitals, that's investing in early years, that's everything you know you could ever dream of, you know, if you wanted a Labour government. And Tony, not perfect, but did it. So I think there are a couple of things. I think Iraq will, for some people, always be the only issue. They can see the prism by which they see Tony Blair. And even if they might concur that he did some, you know, positive things in terms of domestic policies, they will not forgive him. And I think they think he did, you know, that their argument, which I absolutely dispute, was, you know, it was for murky reasons and oil and you know, hand in hand with Bush and all those kind of slightly conspiratorial, stop the war-y type arguments. And then there are those who genuinely were angry about Iraq. They're not conspiratorial, they're very sensible people, but they think what was left was a mess. And probably on balance, even those, you know, who supported at the time can think that as well. It was tricky. So I think there's the Iraq prism.
Sorry,
and I also think
they completely elide the fact that he, together with the Americans, with George Bush, got rid of a dictator who killed more Muslims than any other person in history, got rid of one of the most evil regimes, and he's criticized for it.
Yeah, by Stop the War, who ironically, I remember once wants to stop every war except an article they once wrote about why Arab countries should go to war with Israel. So I think, you know, that you're absolutely right. And I think also what it did was it kind of, it made them unable, because of that kind of their absolute belief that it was wrong. And also I think it did tie with the fact that they never necessarily were comfortable with Tony Blair. There was always on some parts of the left, whereas for me, he absolutely, you know, he was the reason I joined the Labour Party. For a lot of people, they were suspicious of him. He wasn't left enough. And maybe that was to do with his background, or maybe that was to do with his politics, which were broadly moderate to the centre, you know, more centrist than some. So I think there was always that slight suspicion of him and what a Labour politician should be like. And I think also there was a kind of view that, unlike certain Labour politicians, he wasn't of the tradition, you know, he wasn't of the traditions of the Labour Party, which actually should be a positive. If, you know, you should welcome somebody who is slightly different, who can reach out. But I think the Labour Party is a tribe, and with tribes come all these strange psychologies and issues. And I think for Tony, you know, I think it's so sad, and it really does. It was one of the things I found most upsetting, was you just couldn't, you know, you couldn't talk about what Labour achieved under Tony Blair, because, especially under Corbyn, because whereas Corbyn, a man who lost 2 elections, took the party into, you know, kind of electoral defeat, anti-Semitic party, all the rest of it, he is held up as this kind of martyr and icon. And someone like Tony Blair, who was the reason Labour won 3 terms in office, is seen as, you know, this kind of devil figure. It's mad. But then we're speaking logically here, and these people often are not logical. And this is, you know, the party is full of kind of, like any political party, but individuals with lots of different views. And I think for a long time, the obsession with Tony Blair kind of glued this slightly strange group of people together. And then it just becomes unfashionable. Nobody wants to be the person in the room. I mean, I'm always the person in the room saying I love Tony Blair, so I don't mind. But for a lot of people, you know, do you want to be that person? You get a lot of stick, and then you're having to defend everything Tony's ever done and said and earned, and bad Tony trying to make money and bad Tony trying to do this, and people give up, don't they?
Jennifer, one last question, and then perhaps we'll invite questions from the audience. Tony Blair was one of our best friends, and he was a staunch supporter of Israel. Why was that?
Yeah, and actually he was a staunch supporter of Israel when he was Prime Minister, and actually, as you know, when I was Director of Labour Friends of Israel, on every delegation where he was in the region, we'd always visit Tony, and he would always give we took delegations of MPs, whoever they were, we would always meet with Tony Blair, and he was still so, you know, absolutely engaged, obviously as quartet envoy for a bit, but absolutely engaged, knowledgeable, smart, perceptive, speaking to a lot of the key players. I mean, you know, if you want a really in-depth and smart analysis of the Middle East and, you know, Israel, speak to Tony Blair. Interestingly, I don't think he didn't enter politics with a huge interest in foreign affairs. I think in some ways it was something he found as Prime Minister. And I think when he looked around the world and he talked about kind of democracies and, you know, countries that we can build alliances with, I think it was very clear to him that Israel was, you know, one of those countries. And I think it was also very clear to him that on the left, there was a kind of disproportionate focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that people didn't understand the situation. And I think as he understood it more and met people, I think he absolutely, in the same way Northern Ireland, wanted to help and is a very persuasive person, does have these huge, you know, this huge ability to bring people together. But I think he also wanted to actually explain, partly, you know, to understand and explain to the party that it's not black and white, and it's not Israel bad and Palestinians good, and everything can be seen through this kind of very, you know, reductive prism. I think he was very keen for the party on foreign affairs to be balanced, and Israel's that yardstick. I think if you're able to have a sensible debate on Israel, and by sensible I mean critical, yes, absolutely, but not frothing at the mouth, you know, Israelis are Nazis in disguise and all the stuff that I'd see you know, I'd get emailed on a weekly basis or tweeted at. You know, I think he very much wanted to see the Labour Party as a force for good in that debate, and therefore wanted to educate it. And he, you know, he continues to be a friend and a, you know, a huge presence, I think, for those of us who are still engaged and interested in Middle East politics. I always listen to him.
Yeah. Fascinating. Rabbi Portnoy, I can't see the audience for some reason. I don't know if I'm looking at the wrong screen, but I don't know if we have any members of the audience who'd like to ask Jennifer a question.
If anybody wants to ask a question, you can either switch your video on so that we can see where you are and who you are, or you can send it in the chat, or you can use one of the raise hand apps chat things. Okay, so it looks like maybe someone from the Littman family, I don't know. Your video's gone on, Jeffrey. Is that for a question? You're unmuted. Okay, we're unmuted. While other people think of sensible questions, I'll just say, do you agree with the analysis of Professor Colin Schindler that Israel's problems with the left came about as a result of the Bandung Conference, which I'm one of the few here old enough to remember, when there was a non-aligned movement with people like, you know, Nasser and Tito and Sukarno all getting together to say, we don't want to be in the Soviet camp, we don't want to be in the Western capitalist American dominated camp, we're going to be a new force and a force for good. And all the Arab countries, when they heard that Israel was going to attend, said, we're not coming unless you disinvite Israel. So Israel was duly disinvited. And Professor Schindler said that meant from then on, we're talking about 1950s, much earlier than you were suggesting, from then on, Israel had no friends except NATO countries, and especially America. What's your view on that analysis?
Can I?
Oh, Sandy wants to say something, sorry.
Can I throw in something a little bit more recent than Jeffrey's focal point? And that's the 1970s, when the UN voted that Zionism is racism. And that vote may well have colored a generation of leftist university students who have now reached, I hesitate to use the word maturity, but certainly voting age. I move on.
Shall I answer, David? Shall I come back? Or yeah. I think that's really interesting. Colin Schindler, I think, is absolutely fascinating. And yes, I think partly, I guess, that there's always been an issue with the alliances Israel has been able to make. And actually, what's amazing is recently they've been extended with the Abraham Accords, and there's kind of, positive news there. But I think perhaps, yes, the issue was always whether Israel was seen as a kind of part of the nation of the good. And for an awfully long time, perhaps it wasn't. And I think there was a certain, when Israel, it was kind of plucky Israel, and when it started, there was a sense of perhaps more solidarity on the left. And gradually, partly because obviously the animosity of so many Arab states, and perhaps the left's willingness to start seeing them as the underdog and Israel as the aggressor, as Israel fought more wars and won more wars. And so I do, I agree in many ways that there was always this kind of difficulty for Israel in terms of kind of its international alliances. But then the flip side is, Israel for many of its early years was a socialist country, and actually in many ways people forget. When we go on delegation, we still, when I worked at LFI, went on delegation, visited kibbutzes and moshavim, and it's fascinating for the MPs to see this, and there's not many around, and they're certainly not in the same way they used to be. But this is a party which at its very heart, in a way, in many ways, could not have kind of survived because, unless it was because of the kind of socialist principles and the kind of collectivism. And people, it's very difficult now because people have short memories, and what they remember is Bibi Netanyahu and barely before that. And they might not even remember, a little bit then of Barak and vaguely Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. But, those big Labour totemic figures obviously are not around anymore. So I think, the flip side was it should have been easier. And I think it was for a little while for Labour, for international Labour, political party to show solidarity with Israel, but that did partly become harder because the international alliances that were and weren't forged. And I think, yes, you're right, there was the Zionism as racism. You look back now, and I think that was, incredibly powerful for all the wrong reasons. And I think there were a group of kind of academics and campaigners who found that a defining moment in terms of their political outlook, and they could never really get over that. And possibly also they'd say, well, the kind of what they call, occupation and Palestinian rights, and that was all kind of wrapped in with Zionism being, in their eyes, this kind of imperialist, racist ideology. And look, we've seen it recently in Bristol University, and with a professor who refuses to accept what he's doing or saying is in any way, racist and anti-Semitic. It's only anti-Zionist. And you have a young Jewish society there afraid and feeling victimized and being accused of all manner of atrocities. And it's mad. And I think he probably was brought up, I think there was a whole group of leftists of a certain generation who were very much brought up to see Israel in that way and see the formation of the PLO and Arafat, as freedom fighters and people without a state. And it's in the same way I used to talk about the number of Jews who were expelled from Arab lands, nearly 1 million, who have never returned to their homes and made homes for themselves elsewhere. And I'd say that to some of the MPs I would meet with and talk to them about how, borders can be cloudy and people move. And my descendants are Polish and Russian, and I'm not sure if I went back to Russia, I'd be given the property that was, or the land that was once mine, etc. And you know, that they didn't know about these Jews who left these Arab countries. They weren't sure, and that's because that wasn't what was discussed in the 70s at university. What was discussed was Zionism and Israel, you know, launching aggressive wars or seizing land that isn't theirs. And I think it's very hard. People say you stay in the politics of your, you know, your formative years, your most idealistic years, your kind of teenage and 20s, and you never really leave that place. Yeah. And I think that's certainly the case for Jeremy. I think it's Jeremy Corbyn. I think it's certainly the case for a lot of those on the left. Those formative years spent in those sorts of places have never left them.
Jennifer, I'm glad you mentioned Professor Miller at Bristol University, because the focus of his attention wasn't Zionism, it's Jews. And I've got in front of me the quote of a talk he gave to Labour Left Alliance in June 2020. And this is what this man said. Of course, the Israelis have sent people in to target that, to deal with that, particularly through interfaith work. Now, pretending Jews and Muslims working together will be an apolitical way of countering racism. No, it's a Trojan horse for normalizing Zionism in the Muslim community. We saw it in an East London mosque where they unknowingly held this project of making chicken soup, with Jewish and Muslim communities coming together. This is an Israeli-backed project to normalize Zionism within the Muslim community. And they are doing that at the same time they're doing the attack on Corbyn. I mean, what an outrageous statement to make. And it's astonishing that 257, I think it is, academics have just signed a letter in support of David Miller, who doesn't like to see Jews and Muslims associate with each other. I mean, what does that
it's, I mean, that I find that whole episode incredibly upsetting, because I think, you know, I found it tough at Labour Friends of Israel, the abuse and the kind of comments like that, and the fact that, you know, at best they'd assume you were Mossad and you could kind of laugh about it when there's 5 of you in this tiny little office in Westminster and you're being accused of controlling the world or being a spy, you know. But actually it's upsetting. And in Bristol, it's students, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds who have gone to university to study and to have a nice time, and they see a professor, someone they should be able to trust in a position of authority, saying these things. I mean, my goodness, how mad and paranoid do you have to be to see chicken soup as some kind of global conspiracy? I mean, it's just mad. But these people, it's like, you know, McCarthy's the Reds under the beds. They see Zionists everywhere. And in his worldview, of course, you know, of course the Zionists are in charge of interfaith. And of course, interfaith isn't about actually bringing communities together. And what better way than to do that through food? And yes, chicken soup, wonderful. No, there has to be this ulterior motive, because that's what Zionists do. And where's that language from? Ulterior motives, you know, kind of sneaky. It's all traditional anti-Semitic tropes and language, seeing the Jew as somehow part of this shady, you know, secretive group. And I think to have someone like that, the crank, you can imagine, you know, this mad person kind of half drunk walking around saying that, you laugh at. When it's a professor at a prestigious university where young Jewish students are saying, we feel scared, and then 250 fellow academics sign a letter of support, that scares me. And without being, you know, I absolutely don't want to end up on a pessimistic note, but that is what happens when you normalize a degree of anti-Semitism. That's what happens when the society, you know, when you have a political party where it is normalized, and that bleeds out into society. And why I always say to people, it's not pessimistic to be alert and to fight. And I know it's difficult, but I have so much respect for those Bristol students who are being so brave and vocal and taking it on. And I think it's up to everyone to do that, and to never be the person who walks on the other side of the road. And even though it's hard, to always make, you know, your voice heard and to stand up against people like him, because actually you can see these, you know, things can change quickly. Without brave individuals to do that, it becomes, you know, it becomes the norm.
Yeah. Rabbi Portnoy, can we squeeze in one more question? I can see it's 8:55.
We've got time for one more question before I hand over to Rabbi Ginsbury. to wrap up this evening's proceedings. So anybody who'd like to ask a question, if you want to show your face, take the video, put the video on, or you can just speak, take the mute off. Anybody?
Can I ask a question?
Over to you, Bob.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thanks very much. It's really very interesting. I'd like to ask a more general question, if I may, about the relationship between leaders and their followers. The leader is at the top of the pyramid, and you have people under them. But how much control do they actually have? Is it leadership by control or by consent?
I mean, a bit of both. And in terms of the Labour Party, it's a funny party obsessed with structures and structures within structures. So the leader of the Labour Party does have an awful lot of power. So once you get the right leader, in a way, half the battle is kind of won, because they set the tone, they set their shadow cabinet, they can hire, or they can certainly look at hiring the people around them, the general secretary. But at the same time, they can't, if there are members of the party who are doing things or saying things that the leader or, doesn't like, it's very different. You can't just get rid of members. You have to have a reason. There's a constitution. The Labour Party will use that. Now, under Corbyn, it used it very loosely. And so there's, in theory, it did have the power to expel racist members, but it didn't use it. Now you have a leader who will use the powers it has, and also what Keir Starmer said is accept every recommendation from the Human Rights Equality Commission. So I think the leader does have an awful lot of power within the Labour Party, and and a lot of that does come from the patronage he or she is able to give and to use. So, for example, Keir Starmer sacked Rebecca Long-Bailey for kind of retweeting, supporting an article where there was a kind of, I can't actually remember the details of it now, but an anti-Semitic, I think she was quoting an actress who'd said something conspiratorial and kind of vaguely anti-Semitic. And so he can very much set the tone. But you saw when towards the end of Tony Blair's leadership, there was still a lot of dissent, and actually a lot of MPs ended up kind of, trying to topple him and what have you. So even when you are leader, and even when you're a successful leader, it doesn't mean that everything is necessarily easy. And the Labour Party, I think, like the Tory Party as well, very much like the Tory Party, actually, they're slightly more brutal in a funny way with their leaders than the Labour Party. But there are so many different individuals with different ambitions and different kind of worldviews. It's always hard for a leader to bring everyone together. But I always said, my previous, the ex-chair of Labour Friends of Israel, Joan Ryan, would always talk about how the Labour Party is a broad church. But she said even churches have doors and roofs and walls. And so I think for the leader, there's that balance between using your power and being a broad church, so to speak, and having people with different views, but at the same time saying there are certain views that are not acceptable. For example, if you're a conspiratorialist, or if you're anti-Semitic, or if So I think that, I think reasons to be positive are, as your question was about leadership, I think the leader is in place, and that's a lot of the hard work done. But the flip side is, it doesn't mean that you can do exactly what you want when you want.
Jennifer, I'm going to cut in because we have a minute before I think the Zoom cuts off. Can I invite Rabbi Ginsbury to express thanks for the privilege of you addressing us this evening, and what an interesting event it's been.
Thank you very much, David. I think we may actually probably have 5 minutes grace beyond that, and but Rabbi Portnoy probably doesn't want us to know too much about that, so we'll try and keep it within a minute or two. First of all, I'd like to thank you, David, for once again sharing one of these Zoom evenings with such eloquence and really such a clear grasp of the issues that need to be covered this evening, and thank you for that. I'd like to thank Kenny Brand, who was the person, I think, who made the shidduch, if I can use that term, between Henry United Synagogue and Jennifer this evening. We didn't know about your husband's having been bar mitzvah at the shul at the time when it was first made. Had we known that, I'm sure we'd have done it with even greater alacrity. But we really are indebted to you for joining us this evening and sharing the very interesting insights which you have shared with us with such clarity and willingness. I must, of course, thank Rabbi Portnoy, as ever, for hosting and looking after the technical arrangements so well for us throughout this period of lockdown. He was one of the first rabbis to get onto Zoom and to get us up and running with our virtual provision, and that's been developed during the course of the year, and we're so grateful to him for that. Jennifer, you may not realize that people like you coming forward make such a difference to us. Our offering has been one which has really been rich in its content in so many different ways, whether it's been political, whether it's been cultural, whether it's been religious, whether it's been something which has just been there to try and lift people's spirits with a bit of entertainment. So many different areas we've covered. We're just after, of course, in the aftermath of the afterglow, I should say, rather than aftermath of Purim, and that certainly has a tremendous amount to teach us and to show us that there really is nothing new under the sun. Perhaps in certain ways, cynically, we put it as plus ça change, plus à la même chose, and we find that we go through life and find once again that we're confronted by an apparent anti-Semite, and the way in which that person appears to be casting such a dark shadow over the Jewish future, and then suddenly he or she is removed from the scene, and we find ourselves with a very different set of circumstances, what appears to be a much happier, more blessed set of circumstances. But of course, as a Jewish community, we realize that there is a balance to be struck between the way that we make efforts, the way that we do indeed involve ourselves in the public sphere in areas of debate. I remember Jeffrey, if I may say so, Jeffrey, who just a few moments ago joined us, Jeffrey Lippman, in some conversation. We had a conversation during the darkest days of the Corbyn era, and you and I were talking about, how long can one remain with the Labour Party? And you said to me, Rabbi, have faith. And you said, things can change, things can turn around, and hopefully, indeed, one is seeing that in a certain way. But we also realize that that sense of balance and faith we have is part of the broader perspective which we as a community try to embrace religiously, culturally, in terms of activism, in terms of all aspects of that which we do. So I really want to thank all of you who have been so critical in bringing this evening together. Above all else, once again, to you, Jennifer, to sharing with us so generously your knowledge, your insight, your expertise. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for another fascinating Hendon United Synagogue Zoom evening, of which we hope and trust there will be more, but of a hybrid fashion very soon, as we're able to move more into in-person activity. And Jennifer will be able to invite you back, and you can have a bit of our hospitality on our shore premises with a tea, coffee, and some cake or something. And it will be a pleasure to hear from you once again if you're willing to join us. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you very much. It's very nice to meet you.
Thank you.